Many people have heard of the Berlin Conference and the evil that took place there. Not many have heard of the Genoa Conference, though. In April 1922, European countries and British colonies met in Genoa, Italy, to discuss integrating Russia and Germany into the European capitalist economy. This objective was largely a flop, but the meeting produced something else sinister and rarely spoken about. Soon after the end of World War I, international bankers decided that the time was ripe to establish central banks worldwide, and that's what they discussed in Genoa, mostly because they loved the independent Federal Reserve System in the United States. In 1922, there were only a handful of central banks in the world, and as the London Financial Review put it, Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, praised central banking after its early haphazard growth to a scientific system which he solidified at Genoa. The Genoa Conference was attended by heads of state, governors of the central banks of England, France, the United States, and other international bankers. The delegates resolved to set up central banks in all countries that didn't have them. The governor of the Bank of England played a prominent part in establishing central banks, assisted by able and experienced experts such as Henry Strakosch, who had convinced South African Prime Minister John Smuts to form a central bank in South Africa in 1920. In Genoa, the international bankers led by the Bank of England governor resolved not only that every country would have a central bank but, most crucially, that these banks would be independent of their country's governments. Okay, so who would they be dependent on? On the matter of independence, journalists at the meeting wrote that on this issue the bankers insisted rather dogmatically. In other words, the state would not govern the sphere of money. This would be left to the international bankers themselves. They and Field 1936 wrote, "The paid economists at Genoa duly discovered that reserve banks were marvelous scientific improvements." The newspapers joined in the chorus of applause, and the politicians of the various states behaved as so many influencers leading the sheep to the slaughterhouse. Field continues, "The fact was entirely overlooked that the financiers are in no sense public servants, but simply the paid agents of the shareholders in a banking company whose interests need not in the least be identical with the national interest." Governments that agreed to allow central banks were told that they would benefit by having their central banks ship away all their gold. They were told this gold did not accumulate interest and it was a waste to hold when they could exchange it for interest-bearing paper. Reserve banks of each country would keep their gold reserves in London and get British pounds in return. But because the pound was ravaged by inflation throughout the 1920s, Britain could print the pound without worrying about countries using it to get their gold back. Central banks mushroomed worldwide, particularly after 1930, as puppet governments surrendered their nation's sovereignty to central bankers. Meanwhile, the citizens whom these banks intended to enslave applauded it. When bankers agreed in Genoa that central banks would be independent, they meant they would be dependent on private commercial banks. The primary purpose of central banks would be to protect the monopoly commercial banks have to create and control money. Another purpose of a central bank's so-called independence is to protect the private banks from the public when the economy experiences unemployment, recession or inflation, to hide where the real power behind the economy lies, i.e. with the private banks. To underline Genoa's importance, they introduced a system in which governments would have no power. Because everything, commodities, labor, infrastructure, etc. is valued in money, whoever controls the creation of the money controls everything in the nation. To underline Genoa's importance, they introduced a system in which governments would have no power. Because everything, commodities, labor, infrastructure, etc. is valued in money, Whoever controls the creation of the money controls everything in the nation. Because the banks are the only institutions that can issue and control the amount of money available for anyone, including the government, if bankers don't like how the government is doing things, they are in a good position to turn the public against it. Lastly, the biggest trick the devil played in Genoa was to convince everyone that a central bank is somehow a part of government and is actually answerable to the state, even as it keeps reminding everyone how its independence from government is sacrosanct pure evil genius.
The most important person in the world is the storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation to come.